Greetings. As many know, there has been a centuries-long debate over whether Christ's statement in Matthew 16:18 means that Peter is the rock upon which Christ will build his church, or if something other than Peter, such as Peter's faith, might be the rock upon which Christ would build his church. In English, the verse typically has Christ saying to Shimon or Simon, "You are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church." Now, as some note, the word Peter itself comes from the word Petros, which itself means rock, and therefore they argue there's a play on words here, right? Petros is the rock upon which Christ will build his church. However, others have long objected that in the Greek text, two different words are used, and proponents of this approach will, readily concede that Petros is cognate with Petra, that the words are related, but they'll nonetheless insist that these are two different kinds of stone, therefore the rock upon which Christ builds his church is a different rock from Peter, right? That's the argument. Now, as a disclaimer, I have no intention of attempting to settle that debate in this video, but I did want to take a look at Christ's statement in the Syriac and Ge'ez translations of the Bible. Because I think some might find this interesting. The Syriac version has been appealed to by others, but I'm not aware of anyone looking at the Ge'ez text within the context of this debate. So I wanted to do so in this video, at the very least, because I thought, as I said, some might find this interesting or even helpful, right? So jumping right in, this is a copy of the New Testament in Syriac from the ba-Máh. Now, the ba-Máh New Testament is available online, but I wanted to look at the relevant texts in a hard copy. And so with that, we can now open the book and turn to the Gospel of Matthew. And on this page, one can find the 16th chapter, hence the little 욥 at the top of the page, right? That's Matthew 16, right? And then we can go down to verse 18, which is a little bit lower on this page. And the relevant text quotes Christ as stating, "Antu kifa wa'al-hade kifa ibne lid'ati." You are kifa, and on this kifa I will build my church, or my congregation, or my assembly. And at the top of your screen, I have transcribed the consonantal strings into the corresponding Latin characters. And I just want to put forth the important disclaimer that this is only showing the consonants, not how they're vocalized. And aside from that, I also provide a minor parsing of each word along with any prefixes or suffixes. And the significant part here, as has been pointed out by others before me, is that the same word is used. Shimon or Peter is called Kepha, and then Christ states that he will build his church on this Kepha, right? So the same word is used, at least in the Syriac text, if not the Greek text. And we can now close that volume. But before we get to the Ge'ez text, I would like to quickly look at the Old Syriac reading, which predates the ba-Máh. So this is the compilation of Old Syriac texts, which was edited by Agnes Smith-Lewis. And as we flip this over, you can see the Old Syriac Gospels on the spine here. But opening this up, Matthew 16 begins on this page, and it continues on to the next page. And a bit lower on that page is where we find verse 18. Now, for those who don't know, the two major manuscripts for the Old Syriac Gospels are Sinaiticus, or Sinaiticus palimpsest, and then the manuscript, which is called Ɂm'urytonianos. Now, the Sinaiticus or Sinaiticus text does not include Matthew 16:18, right? It has a number of lacunae, but ŨRYtonianos does include Matthew 16:18. And therefore, you see the abbreviation ɁΚουρετών, which is short for ɁΟυρετονιάνος, towards the top right of your screen. And that signifies that this text comes from that manuscript. And here's the relevant line. Now, although different scripts are used between the two texts that we looked at, this portion of the text is identical. They read the same way, letter for letter. So I just wanted to show this to make clear that when it comes to Christ's statement in Matthew 16:18, the ba-Máh and the Old Syriac text read the same way. Kifa and Kifa. Now, having shown that, we can now turn to the Ge'ez text. And for that, I want to look at this volume here, titled Ḥadis Kidán, which means New Testament, right? Hadis means new, Kidán means testament or covenant, I think. And this volume is over 100 years old, so I have to handle it delicately, but I'll open it up to the title page where, again, we see Ḥadis Kidán. And towards the bottom of the page, we see that it was published in Asmara, which is now the capital of Eritrea. And it says ba-Máh Fránchaskáno, meaning with the seal or the imprint or the print of Fránchaskáno. So this was published by Franciscan scholars, which is to say Roman Catholic scholars, most likely from Italy. But now we can delicately turn to the page where Matthew 16 begins. At the top of the page, you see Wongeles Matheos, the Gospel of Matthew. And here is where chapter 16 begins. And from there, we can go over to the next page where we find verse 18. And here's the relevant text. Enta quoque wadibazati quoque aḥanጻ la beta Christianie. And just like we did for the Syriac text, we can put a transcription into the Latin script, along with the minor parsing of the words and their respective prefixes and suffixes on the screen. And once again, the salient point here is that the same word is used for both Peter and the rock upon which the church will be built. And in this case, that word is quoque, which is, I admit, a word that I find difficult to pronounce. Quoque. Nonetheless, having shown that, we can now juxtapose the two texts that we looked at, and we can do so with their respective transcriptions and parsings. And it's important to note, first off, before we close this up, it's important to note that the texts are moving in opposite directions. So the Syriac text goes from right to left, while the Ge'ez text goes from left to right. And the transcriptions of the consonants into the corresponding Latin characters are moving in the same directions. They're moving in the opposite direction. So, for example, that first word on each line, ante, that's the same word, and it's spelled the same in terms of the consonants, right? It's the same string of consonants, the equivalent of aleph, nun, tau. But that might not be immediately apparent if one doesn't keep in mind that the texts are moving in opposite directions. But the central issue here is that in both texts, the same word is used for Peter and for the rock upon which Christ would build his church. The Syriac text, as I noted earlier, uses kifa in both cases, while the Ge'ez text uses quoque. And again, it uses quoque in both cases. Now again, as I said earlier, I don't claim to be able to settle the debate over whether Peter is the rock upon which Christ built his church, at least not to everyone's satisfaction. But I did want to offer this small contribution to the discussion. Right? It seems that ancient linguistically Semitic Christians understood the statement as using the same word in both cases. Moreover, there is the interesting question of to what extent the Syriac text might reflect Christ's precise wording. And I would think it's likely that Christ originally said the statement to Peter in Aramaic, and therefore it's interesting that even while acknowledging that the ancient Syriac texts are, translations. I know some try to posit a Syriac original, but I'm not taking that position. Even if we treat these Syriac texts as translations, which is what I do, it's nonetheless interesting that we can say that when those ancient Aramaic-speaking Christians were translating the text, and when they tried to reproduce Christ's words here, they understood the line as likely employing the same word. Right? And so these are people who understood the Aramaic paradigm well, and that's interesting. And the ancient Ge'ez-speaking Christians likewise came to the same conclusion. It's interesting, food for thought. But with that, I'll close this short video here. As always, comments, questions, or criticisms are always welcome, so feel free to share your thoughts, whether positive or negative, and God bless.